Hello again. John Stott on Paul in Athens. We've got to that section of the chapter in Acts 17 where Paul has been invited to speak in front of some of the most brilliant men in the world, the Athenian philosophers, Stoics and Epicureans among others. And how's he going to speak to them? What's he going to say? What's going to be the subject and the goal of his address? And this is the most famous sermon Paul ever gave, and for that reason is worthy of the closest study. It's only 10 verses. Here we go. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Now what you worship is something unknown. I am going to proclaim to you." Stott says, the apostle took as his text, or rather as his point of contact with them, the anonymous altar he had come across. Reference to such altars, inscribed to an unknown God, have been found in ancient literature. Pausanias, for example, who traveled extensively in about AD 175 and wrote his Tour of Greece, his admiring account of the glory, history, and mythology of that country, began his itinerary in Athens, landing on the rocky peninsula called Piraeus, 5 miles southwest of the city. He found near the harbor a number of temples, together with altars of the gods named Unknown. Having seen such an altar himself, Paul was able to make his opening courteous remark about their religiosity. He was not ready yet to challenge the folly of Athenian idolatry, but he did take up their own acknowledgement of their ignorance. How then shall we interpret his statement that what they were worshipping as something unknown, he was about to proclaim to them? Was he thereby acknowledging the authenticity of their pagan worship? And should we regard with equal charity the cultus of non-Christian religions? For example, is Raymond Panikkar justified in the Unknown Christ of Hinduism in writing, quote, "In the footsteps of St. Paul, we believe that we may speak not only of the unknown God of the Greeks, but also of the hidden Christ of Hinduism," end of quote. Is he further justified in concluding that, quote, "the good and bona fide Hindu is saved by Christ and not by Hinduism, but it is through the sacraments of Hinduism, through the message of morality and the good life, through the mysterion that comes down to him through Hinduism, that Christ saves the Hindu normally," end of quote, from Panikkar. No, Stott says, this popular reconstruction cannot be maintained. We certainly agree that there is only one God. It's also true that converts who turn to Christ from a non-Christian religious system usually think of themselves not as having transferred their worship from one God to another, but as having begun now to worship in truth the God they were previously trying to worship in ignorance, error, or distortion. But N.B. Stonehouse is right that what Paul picked out for comment was the Athenians' open acknowledgement of their ignorance, and that the ignorance rather than the worship is thus underscored. Moreover, Paul made the bold claim to enlighten their ignorance, a Jew presuming to teach ignorant Athenians, using the ego of apostolic authority, and insisting thereby that special revelation must control and correct whatever general revelation seems to disclose. He then went on to proclaim the living and true God in 5 ways, so as to expose the errors, even horrors, of idolatry. First, God is the creator of the universe. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. This view of the world is very different from either the Epicurean emphasis on a chance combination of atoms or the virtual pantheism of the Stoics. Instead, God is both the personal creator of everything that exists and the personal Lord of everything he has made. It is absurd, therefore, to suppose that he who made and supervises everything lives in shrines which human beings have built. Any attempt to limit or localize the Creator God, to imprison him within the confines of man-made buildings, structures, or concepts, is ludicrous. Secondly, God is the sustainer of life, and he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. That's verse 25. God continues to sustain the life which he has created and given to his human creatures. It is absurd, therefore, to suppose that he who sustains life should himself need to be sustained, that he who supplies our need should himself need our supply. Any attempt to tame or domesticate God, to reduce him to the level of a household pet dependent on us for food and shelter, is again a ridiculous reversal of roles. We depend on God. He does not depend on us. Thirdly, God is the ruler of all nations. From one man, the Western text of one blood is surely mistaken. Adam is in view as the single progenitor of the human race. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. That's verse 26. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. Some commentators think that Paul's reference here to times and places in verse 26 is to God's preparation of the planet Earth to be our human habitation, and to his provision of the regular seasons, which Paul had mentioned in Lystra back in chapter 14, verse 17. The nations, times, and places, however, seem to be more particular than this, and to refer rather to the epochs of their history and the limits of their territory. That's the version in the New English Bible. Thus, although God cannot be held responsible for the tyranny or aggression of individual nations, yet both the history and the geography of each nation are ultimately under his control. Further, God's purpose in this has been so that the human beings he has made in his own image might seek him and perhaps reach out for him, or feel after him, the Revised Standard Version, a verb which denotes the groping and fumbling of a blind man. And find him, the text says. Yet this hope is unfulfilled because of human sin, as the rest of Scripture makes clear. Sin alienates people from God, even as, sensing the unnaturalness of their alienation, they grope for him. It would be absurd, however, to blame God for this alienation, or to regard him as distant, unknowable, uninterested. For he is not far from each one of us, as Paul says. It is we who are far from him. If it were not for sin, which separates us from him, he would be readily accessible to us. But Paul goes on to say, for in him we live and move and have our being. A quotation from the 6th century BC poet Epimenides of Knossos in Crete. So far we've seen Paul just quoting from Greek poets, or alluding to them at least, not ever quoting from the Old Testament, although certainly he uses Old Testament concepts. And in this part about him not being far away from each one of us, you're reminded, of course, of the Genesis 2 and 3 story, where it is not God that is separated from us. He's actually physically there in the text. It is we who separate ourselves from him, although he remains close by, Paul says, even to Gentiles. So far, we've seen how God alludes to the deity, and it's never doing what we as Jehovah's Witnesses thought he must always do. I mean, there's a reason why Paul wouldn't use the Tetragrammaton in the Jewish context. Jesus honors that reason too, as does Peter and John in the book of Acts. They could be instantly disfellowshipped for using the Tetragrammaton in public, but why does not Paul use it here? After all, the Gentiles probably don't know this name. They've already said, Paul, speak to us about these two words we're not familiar with, anastasis, resurrection, and Jesus, whoever he is, or this God, this female and male deity that they assume they don't know. We dealt with that in a previous segment, but why does not Paul use the Tetragrammaton here? We've spoken to that subject in our videos on Acts 17, so I'll link those. What Paul didn't do and say in Athens, it's one of 3 videos we did on the Athens speech. See you next time.